This is Law of Attraction Explored. I'm Tim Grimes. Some of you are probably wondering about my coaching, so I thought I would just take a minute to explain what it is that I offer. What I do with people is get real deep. And what do I mean by we get deep? Well, if you've been listening to this podcast, you know exactly what I mean when I say that. The kind of coaching that I offer is meant to transform your life. And I feel very confident that it will transform your life and that you'll enjoy doing it. And if you don't, to be frank, you don't have to pay me. I like working with people who want to go deep, people who are willing to explore what's going on the inside and realize that there's nothing wrong with them and that what is going on the inside is actually good. And dare we say it, what's going on the inside is actually God. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, you can always email me at info@radicalcounselor.com, or you can just go to my website, radicalcounselor.com. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. So I thought that I would start this episode out by reading a quote. Here it is. The pendulum of medical thought is swinging away from materialism. The day of the predominance of the pill is past. Practitioners of all schools now realize that a very large part of our weal and woe is the result of our thinking. Probably 90% of all cures have a mental basis independent of the apparent material means employed. This is no argument against a physician or healer of any school, but it is an argument in favor of scientific understanding and employment of mental means for human betterment. Now that's a very relevant quote, and if you're listening to this show, I would assume that you probably agree with most of what was said there. And what's interesting is that the quote is 100 years old, and that nothing much has changed in terms of people appreciating the mental component, the imaginative component, the thinking component to bettering ourselves and healing ourselves than they did 100 years ago. At least when you read something as clear as that, which is the introduction to the American version of self-mastery through conscious autosuggestion. The introduction was written by a guy named Archibald S. Van Orden, who I believe was head of the Coué League of America. This is a fantastic introduction, by the way, and I actually might read, I'm going to read more of it right now. I might read all of it in this episode. We'll see how much time it takes. What's interesting is that these ideas are not new, as we always say. And the principles that were articulated in this seemingly scientific way, or at least in this deeply psychological, non-woo-woo, esoteric BS way, by people like Coué, particularly, they made a heck of a lot of sense when they were being expounded. And many, many physicians and, plenty of psychologists and therapists, or whatever they were called back then. I don't know if they were called therapists, but plenty of psychologists, psychiatrists, as well as physicians, saw the obvious benefit and truth of what Coué was saying. Because again, this is not woo-woo stuff, which I know most of us who listen to the show are into the woo-woo stuff as well. But Coué was really talking about using the imagination as almost like a scientific instrument. And what's interesting, if we just want to get real about it and get sober, is how most of the stuff Coué was talking about has been forgotten about, and how Coué has generally been forgotten about. And I know people will say, placebo, suggestion, there's a lot of documentation now, scientists believe it, the medical community believes it more and more. Yeah, I get that, but not nearly to the degree that they should. When you read something that's 100 years old and is as spot on as this, you realize that perhaps it's almost just the nature of our culture to not grasp the depth of these imaginative and curative ideas that are mental based. It often seems like our culture is just too logical and too bent on being overly rational. And again, I think rationalism is very, very valuable, but too bent on being overly rational, overly scientific, one might say, to really value the profound yet simple advice that Coué shares, and that, many other prominent psychologists and healers have shared over the years that is so obviously psychologically based and so obviously effective, at least in some way. In the introduction, probably 90% of all cures have a mental basis independent of the apparent material means employed. Maybe that number's not as high as 90%. But even if it was only 20%, which it almost certainly is, it would be worth exploring this more deeply. And I know that the medical community is exploring it and the scientific community is exploring it. The problem is they're exploring it from this overly rational angle where they don't fucking get it a lot of the time. And I don't mean to sound overly skeptical, but you have to wonder if they ever will get it. At least the way our culture is set up now. Because you do have to be willing to be a little bit out of the box to embrace your imagination. And Coué was very successful at getting people to believe it because he used a rational, quote-unquote, scientific approach and was very genial and non-dogmatic and open about it. And this introduction by Van Orden gives a good example of that. This, like I said, as I always say whenever we talk about self-mastery through conscious autosuggestion, this book is a masterpiece, okay? Every page of it is worth reading multiple times. And little things like an introduction or small asides in this book are worth reading multiple times. At least 90%, to use that number again. The 80%, 90% of this book you can reread and get something new out of it when you read it again. I've read this book more than any other law of attraction book, and I've benefited from reading it and reading it and reading it over and over again. I mean, listen, if you really dislike it, don't do that. But if you find that your ideas align with it, this is the kind of stuff you can go over continuously. So after that wonderful first paragraph by Van Orden, he went on to write, Emile Coué stands out as leader of the great and ever-increasing host of those who believe that mind is the principal factor in health and sickness. He tells us that in every case the material element has its place, but that this place is one of subservience, that matter is servant, mind is master, and that matter will obey the direction of mind if the thing aimed at is, quote-unquote, in any way possible. This implies that there may be instances in which the desired thing, quote-unquote, is not in any way possible, but Coué does not undertake to define the latter class. After reading of the many cures induced by his method, one cannot avoid the conclusion that further development and application of the method will greatly reduce the field now regarded as the, quote-unquote, impossible. Another brilliant paragraph that you can listen to or read multiple times. One brilliant thing that Coué did is he said, unlike Neville, who said everything is imagination, and that's a huge absolute blanket statement to make. Instead of making such a blanket statement, which then, kind of corners you in a little bit, Coué said, listen, as far as we know, most things seem to be possible with imagination. If it's at all possible, it's going to happen if the imagination is directed in the right way. But he doesn't say everything is possible. He doesn't say you can fly, for instance. I'm not saying that Neville said you could fly either, but it's much easier to swallow something like this when they say in any way possible, if it's within the laws of nature, and not necessarily defining it or saying something absolute like, everything is possible. We hear everything is possible all the time now, and that is kind of it's too much, it just doesn't compute for a lot of us. Doesn't make enough sense. Van Orden went on to write, Coué is scientific. He does not start with a theory and then try to prove it by logic, but he begins with experiments and builds up his theory inductively. He takes you to a clinic where things are being done, not a lecture room where things are being discussed. He recognizes the fact that people not thoroughly acquainted with his method may find in it much that seems childish, but his answer is, it produces results. One feels like paraphrasing the words of another. The lame walk, the ill are made whole, and happy are they who do not stumble at that which is seemingly too simple in my method. Coué is in line with a considerable number of scholars who have studied and utilized hypnotism in its various phases, particularly related to disease. For many years, it was supposed that hypnotism and kindred phenomena were abnormal, but we now know that these phenomena are perfectly natural, that they have been the greatest factors in all the ages for moral and physical health or disease, and that the modern psychologist is merely attempting to use consciously for human good that which had previously been a great uncontrolled power for both good and ill. The unique contributions which Coué has made to human betterment are his recognition of the primary place of the imagination in the cure of disease, and his development of a method whereby the imagination may be energized and directed for its beneficent work. See, this is, everything here is like, it almost seems like common sense. And we so often hear about these law of attraction ideas from these very esoteric places. And Van Orden is presenting Coué's ideas here from just this practical psychological sense. And I hope people who are listening understand how simple yet profound this is. You know, I'm not saying that it's not worth discussing and exploring very far out ideas, you know, and ideas of parallel realities and, you know, quantum physics and all that other stuff. That all has its place. But you can take all that away, and on this practical psychological level of improving our lives and improving the lives of others, you can look at this information through the lens that Coué is looking at it and just be amazed and profoundly shift your approach to life. And if this seems too basic to you, too much like just plain old common sense, I would suggest you stop listening to this show. What's that they say? Common sense is the rarest sense of all. This is like the heartbeat of the law of attraction. And when we don't listen to it, we get too in our head and we lose focus of what's most important in our life, in my opinion.